broadly speaking, the question I want to ask is how we manage to make sense of the things that people say.
Hello, and welcome back to Tomato Tomato. I am your host, Talia Sherman, as always. And what I love about today's episode is that it is another reminder of how inextricably linked to all things language is. There is nothing that language isn't a part of. In the last episode, I interviewed a comparative literature scholar, and today I bring you my interview with Cory Shain, who is a computational linguist, but he could also be described as a computational, neuropsychological, cognitive linguist who's also somehow a mathematician and, to top it all off, an awesome human. And as you'll soon hear, Cory asks really, really big questions. Broadly, he wants to know how language processing works. And with that question, inevitably comes questions of, well, what is language? What are the differences between language and other cognitive processes? How do these processes work? And, of course, how do we test this all? It was such a privilege to interview him for the podcast. I'm so thrilled to be bringing you this interview. So please welcome back into your ears the meticulous, the detail-oriented, and the precise linguist, Cory Shain.
Cory Shain, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. It's such a treat to be here.
Yeah, it's so great to be here. So just to fill in the gap, you gave a talk a few weeks ago here at Brown, which was incredible. Really, really detailed, really interesting. So tell people why you're awesome. What do you do? What do you research? What are you into?
Thanks. I enjoyed my visit to Brown too. I'm glad you found the talk useful. But yeah, generally, I am a linguist. I currently am a postdoc in brain and cognitive sciences at MIT, working under Ed Fedorenko, a neuroscientist there. Prior to that, I did my PhD in linguistics at Ohio State, working with computational linguists, so Mika Elsner and William Schuller, on problems related to how people learn and process language and how we might simulate those learning and processing abilities with computers. And I will be starting next fall as faculty in linguistics at Stanford. So I have a few months to kind of wrap up research that's ongoing now, and I'll be starting a new chapter in a few months.
Yeah, and congratulations on that, by the way. Big deal.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you led right into that. You are a quote unquote linguist, but having read your papers, having heard you speak, you're using methods from so many other disciplines. You have studies where you used methods of fMRI, so like neuroscience methods. And then you're in your abstracts and your discussions, you're bringing in theories of cognitive science and psychology and all these other things. So how do you manage that? How do these other disciplines inform your work?
Yeah, it's a great question. My research has become kind of interdisciplinary, in part because I think that the thing that I want to know about has kind of required this of me. So it wasn't something that I set out very planfully to do. Like, I want to learn about such and such field. It was more that in the process of trying to answer questions I wanted to answer, I found it necessary to learn certain kinds of skills and read certain kinds of literature. So broadly speaking, the question I want to ask is how we manage to make sense of the things that people say. It's a very kind of basic question that many of us don't introspect on much, because language processing kind of comes so easily to many of us, at least in our native languages. But if you think about what's involved, it's rather complicated. Whenever we comprehend a sentence, we have to recognize, for example, what the boundaries are between the meaningful units in this continuous audio stream. Like, where are the words? We then need to retrieve the representations that we have of those words from long-term memory. For example, their meanings, their syntactic information, like whether or not they're nouns and verbs, and what kinds of other word categories they can combine with in order to form phrases. We then need to build some sort of phrasal or dependency representation of the structure that holds those words together within the sentence. So, because that structure then tells us important information about the meaning of the sentence, like who did what to whom. That can be read off of knowing, for example, what the subject versus the object of a verb is. And then we need to build a mental model of that meaning that we can then integrate into our mental model of the other person's beliefs that I'm interacting with, as well as perhaps integrate into my own set of beliefs. Like, I may need to update what I know or what I believe to be true about the world on the basis of the meaning that the person conveyed to me. And all of this happens, we know, based on lots of prior evidence, really fast. So we're actually not waiting until the ends of sentences in order to do all of this work when we have all the information needed in order to do it. we're actually doing all of this processing and integration during comprehension as quickly as we possibly can before we have all the information that we need. And evidence indicates that we're probably doing these kinds of integration operations for many words simultaneously because we're getting tons of words really fast. We get 3 to 4 words per second during speech or reading. And our brain responses to those words last longer than it. So we're having to manage all of this work simultaneously. We're having to contend with uncertainty. It's this really huge computational problem. And yet we solve it so efficiently that we don't really even notice that it's happening. So although this is kind of a big hurdle that we're having to jump over computationally, we don't experience it as such. We just kind of comprehend language and then that happens. And it's almost a reflex, like we can't even really turn it off. If you've ever tried to fall asleep in a room where someone's watching TV, you kind of can't not comprehend what's being said. So I think that I find really fascinating, and that's what I want to understand. And that description of the problem that I'm targeting, I think, is the explanation for why I end up drawing on many different fields. So there's certainly a computational aspect to the problem of language processing. And so I want to understand how to model and perhaps simulate these abilities in algorithms, but it's also happening in our brains. So I want to understand the brain implementation of these computations and how those then affect our thoughts, our beliefs, and so on. So hence the connection to cognitive science. And all of this is kind of wrapped around the central core of language use, language comprehension and production, and hence the interest in linguistics.
Yeah, from reading research, I was really interested in like how you're bringing all these other disciplines, but also the questions you're asking. I think it is important to give a little bit of context on this. The questions you're asking are really big. Like it seems a little bit weird, as you're saying, because it's like you can't just stop comprehending language. You can't just stop hearing language, understanding it, using it. And yet you're asking really big questions that might not be resolved or answered in your lifetime or my lifetime. And so props to you for going after those questions. And a part of your research is looking at kind of word frequency and predictability and looking at something that you've talked about a lot about processing cost. You've alluded to this, but it's like when we're hearing speech, we're doing all these complex computations, operations to get us to understand what the other person is saying, and then also to plan what we're going to say as well. So talk to me about what processing cost is, how probability factors into that, and then just kind of like what is happening as we're doing this sort of word building process in our brains.
Sure. So I think you're talking now about a family of studies that I've been working on using, trying to understand the determinants of reading behaviors. So for example, how long we spend reading words word by word during experiments where we bring people into the lab or have them read online and we track their reading times. So the reason for this kind of measures, or reading time measures, have a very long history in psycholinguistics because the fluctuation in the amount of time that we spend reading winds up having a lot of interesting correlates with theoretical ideas about what is hard or easy about processing words individually in context. And the reason that's interesting is because it's one window that we have into the underlying mechanisms that enable comprehension. So when I want to develop a theory of how people comprehend something, that theory is probably going to involve a couple of components. It'll involve hypotheses about what kinds of representations somebody is building in their minds of what they're reading or hearing. And then secondly, how difficult the updates are to those representations when they get new information. So like what kinds of steps are involved in updating those representations and how difficult those steps might be. By difficulty, I just mean like the amount of computation needed. So to give a specific example, one candidate theory of comprehension difficulty from the psycholinguistics literature that's gotten a lot of traction is this idea of dependency locality. So the syntactic relations between words introduce dependencies between them such that you kind of need two words in order to understand the relationship that they communicate. So one such dependency is like a subject-verb dependency between the subject of a verb and the verb that it's the subject of. So if I say the cat eats, then I have a very small dependency between cat and eats, right? So the verb is the very next thing. But language allows me to insert material there. So I have like the cat that my neighbor adopted yesterday eats. Now I have a longer dependency between eats and its subject, the cat. And so this one idea is that constructing a longer dependency may be more difficult. That is, it may require a more demanding working memory operation to retrieve the meaning of the cat because it was encountered a while ago and its representation may have been interfered with by intervening material. So that's just one example of a hypothesis about the algorithms that might support language comprehension that can be cashed out as a prediction about how long people will spend reading words. So under that hypothesis, I'll predict that eats will take longer to read because it involves a harder working memory operation when the subject is further away in the past than when it's nearer in the past. And there are quite a lot of ideas of that kind from psycholinguistic theories that we can test using reading. So that brings me to a couple of different ideas about language comprehension that I have chosen to attack using reading data. The first of these concerns the frequency of words. So if I encounter a frequent word like cat that I have a lot of experience with, my memory representation for cat may be stronger and cat may be more accessible in long-term memory than my representation of a word like cassowary or some other word that I may vaguely know the meaning of, but I haven't experienced very much. And so fluctuation in how frequently words are used in our actual experience may end up governing how easy it is to retrieve and process words in the mental lexicon. But relatedly, it's kind of well established now that how predictable words are from context also affects how hard they are to retrieve or to process. So, for example, if I say she purchased and I say soda, that's a relatively predictable continuation of she purchased a. But then if I say cauldron, that's less predictable because it's a less frequent word. But then if I can flip this by changing the context. So if I say she stirred the boiling, then suddenly soda is less predictable than cauldron. So we take into account prior context in informing our expectations about what the future holds. And so there's been a kind of like a long history of debate in linguistics about, or in psycholinguistics about the causes, the mechanisms that underlie these predictability effects. So what these kinds of effects say about comprehension and what the relationship is between things like predictability and frequency, which tend to travel together. They co-vary a lot during ordinary language. So I've run a couple studies looking into these questions to try to get at some of the mechanisms that might be underlying these effects that we observe in behavior.
Yeah. And so two of the studies that you've done, one's called Word Frequency and Predictability Dissociate in Naturalistic Reading. And the second one is Large Scale Evidence for Logarithmic Effects of Word Predictability on Reading Time. And I do want to stress that again and again throughout these papers, you're talking about the difference between frequency and predictability. So yes, again, soda is more frequent than cauldron, but given the context of she stirred the boiling, cauldron would be a more apt choice than soda. And you're asking the question of whether frequency prediction involve separable cognitive processes. So what's going on there with the separable cognitive processes, but then also, what do the answers to these questions tell us? Because I know that the answers to the research questions you're asking lead to more research questions that lead to perhaps really revolutionary findings.
Yeah, so I'll start with the second part. So what's at stake in the questions that I'm asking? So what does it mean for there to be these kinds of effects in reading? And the reason that I'm interested in this question is that I think it helps tease apart empirically two rather different and I think similarly popular ways of thinking about the comprehension problem during reading and during listening, but we can kind of measure it more easily during reading. And so they kind of focus on like two halves of the problem to different degrees. So one part of the problem of comprehension is the problem of assembling the right representation of a sentence. So the theory that I sketched out earlier about dependency locality is an example of this way of thinking about comprehension. The process of assembling a representation, say a syntactic representation of the sentence, word by word, is itself difficult. So if I want to construct a syntactic dependency, I'm going to experience difficulty. I'm going to experience cognitive load in proportion to how much computation is involved in assembling that representation. And so this is this is kind of, I think, one of the older streams in psycholinguistics of thinking about the problem of comprehension, going back at least 5 decades or so to the early 60s, when people started talking about the influence of working memory capacity and working memory constraints on how hard or easy sentences are to understand. And you can think about this like, so kind of like one of the illustrative examples would be self-embedding or center embedding sentences, where I can take like a simple declarative sentence like the cart broke, and I can embed another sentence within that sentence using a relative clause. So I can say the cart the horse pulled broke. And that sentence is harder for people than the first one. So although I'm obeying the rules of English grammar with the second sentence, the processing demands seem to be higher, but it's still manageable. But you might imagine, well, okay, well I can insert one relative clause. Why don't I insert a second relative clause inside the one I just inserted? And then the whole thing falls apart. So if I say the cart, the horse, the farmer bought, pulled, broke, for most people that's completely incomprehensible. It's pretty easy to break people's comprehension abilities by making sentences that are kind of too complicated. And the definition of complicated was cashed out in terms of working memory capacity. Like how many different aspects of the analysis can I hold in memory simultaneously before I get so many collisions that I just can't process anymore? So there's a whole stream of thinking in psycholinguistics that's trying to characterize the nature of the memory systems, the nature of the capacity limits, the nature of the memory update operations and their difficulty that can explain processing patterns that we observe in experiments. There's a somewhat newer and rather different way of thinking about processing difficulty in terms of information theory. And so this way focuses less on the problem of how hard it is to assemble a particular representation and more on the problem of figuring out what representation I ought to assemble in the first place. So contending with uncertainty. So in my kind of illustrating example of why I asked these questions, I was talking about how we're having to do all of the processing that we're doing about language without sufficient information in order to do it with complete confidence. Like we're having to make educated guesses over the course of comprehension. And it turns out that problem of making an informed guess based on the available evidence about what the correct analysis of the full sentence will be is potentially quite serious as well. And that may actually incur effort. So you can actually think about an interpretation of a sentence not as being a specific memory structure, but instead as being a probability distribution over many possible analyses of the unfolding sentence, weighted according to their probability, given the evidence that is the words that I've seen so far. And then difficulty, according to this view, is thought to reflect the difficulty of updating that distribution when new evidence comes in. Like how much do I have to change my interpretation distribution based on the word that I've observed? And so words that require big changes are more informative. That is, they narrow the space of interpretations more and then require more cognitive effort. And so under that view, the representations themselves are free. And then the hard part is figuring out which one to prioritize in my interpretation. So they're really kind of, I think, two different ways of conceiving of the fundamental problem of comprehension. Is it about structure building or is it about inference and contending with uncertainty? And so that's, I think, the motivating question behind a couple different studies I've done recently. One of them is focused on specifically on predictability effects and whether predictability effects are best characterized by a kind of working memory view or a probabilistic inference view. And then the second study focuses on a contrast between predictability effects and frequency effects. And again, asking the same basic question, whether the patterns that we observe in these two effects is best explained by a more working memory view or a more probabilistic inference view. And I think one of the interesting things about these two studies taken together is that they point in somewhat different directions. So like the predictability study supports an interpretation of predictability effects in terms of probabilistic inference more than facilitation in assembling representations in working memory. Whereas the frequency versus predictability study kind of points in the other direction and suggests that the process of retrieving words from memory imposes difficulty during comprehension that's at least partially separable from the difficulties involved in the probabilistic update. So I think that taken together, these things these two findings help inform both the kinds of processes that we need to take seriously in our theorizing. So I think that like the predictability study supports a central role for probabilistic inference during comprehension, as well as the kind of conceptual boundaries on, how far a purely probabilistic theory can go. And so the frequency study, I think, supports an additional role for kind of difficult memory retrieval operations.
So looking at another batch of studies that you did, I'm just going to list them off. Robust effects of working memory demand during naturalistic language comprehension in language selective cortex. fMRI reveals language-specific predictive coding during naturalistic sentence comprehension. And similarity of computations across domains does not imply shared implementation, the case for language comprehension. I want to start actually with the language-specific cortex. So finally, I understand something. I'm in a neurolinguistics class with the one and only Sheila Bloomstein. We are talking about what parts of the brain perhaps are specialized or localized for language. When you're talking about the language-specific cortex, that's a big deal because some people disagree. And there is some evidence to suggest that other parts of the brain, in fact, do language other than the left hemisphere. So start with the language-specific cortex.
It's true that the different studies you mentioned kind of touch on different questions. So I'll do my best to kind of talk about general features. But the question you asked about the language network, yes, is kind of a common assumption that underlies the way that we attack the questions in all the studies you mentioned. So you're right. It's far from established. It's not the case that consensus has yet emerged on the existence or the nature of a brain system that's specialized for language. I happen to work with Ev Fedorenko, who has been one of the kind of leading advocates for the existence of a language network in recent years. And so I'm rather aware of the evidence for the existence of this network, and I find it pretty compelling, and therefore assume it in a lot of my work in trying to understand the brain implementation of language. And so I can kind of briefly summarize both why we might or might not think the language network exists, and then what the current evidence for its existence is. So some of the earliest work on language in the brain suggested that, for example, work of Broca and Wernicke suggested that there were parts of the brain that were particularly important or involved in language processing. If those parts got damaged, then you would have struggles either producing or comprehending language. And the precise details of what those brain areas are and which particular functions get impaired or under damage have been the subject of a very long, 150-year-long conversation that's still very much ongoing. But that kind of biased the literature towards thinking about language in terms of specific functionally specialized areas of the brain. And so, a longstanding question has been the extent to which the brain areas for language are selectively linguistic or are shared with other domains of cognition.
Yeah. So with Broca and Wernicke, what you're talking about there, just to really make you understand what's going on, they're taking patients who are aphasics, suffering from aphasia, lesions to certain areas of the brain, testing their linguistic capability, and then making extrapolations. Okay, this area of the brain has a lesion. This part of language that we've broken down into a part is damaged. Therefore, this part of the brain probably is specialized or responsible for the core processes in this one part of language, which is then a process or a part of the larger process of language in general. So it is important, I think, to name that what language is sometimes fuzzy, and then also what goes into language is sometimes fuzzy, and then also language is multifaceted and really complex in its entirety. So
agreed. Yeah, that's the reason for the fact that these debates are still ongoing. Is language, defining language is hard, and then however you define it, it needs to interface with a vast array of other cognitive abilities. So even if we do have functionally specialized brain areas, those areas must have strong communication with executive areas involved in using linguistically mediated information in order to solve tasks, motor areas involved in, for example, articulation, long-term or conceptual semantic areas or episodic memory. So there's all sorts of different parts of cognition that need to interface with language. Right. So why do I think that there is really a language network in the brain? There's a couple reasons. The first is that it turns out to be possible to damage language function rather selectively. So there's, for example, Fedorenko and Varley 2016 worked with a variety of patients with different types of aphasia and then tested them really carefully on a wide battery of other kinds of cognitive functions that are related to language, including different kinds of problem-solving tasks, music comprehension. There were 5 or 6 other types of kind of closely related cognitive domains on which the patients had essentially no deficits. So their damage to language was rather selective in comparison to closely related kinds of functions. So it seems possible to selectively damage language. Now, just because somebody has damage to a region that's canonically associated with language doesn't mean that their damage will be selective, right? Because brain damage tends not to diffuse along functional lines. Like usually many different functions are impaired under damage. But the fact that it's possible in some cases to selectively impair language function suggests that it can be spatially separated from other kinds of cognitive functions at the individual level. Another piece of evidence comes from work using functional localization paradigms. So one of the problems with trying to say whether or not a particular function is localized or has specialized tissue in the brain is that the particular pieces of brain tissue that implement that function in an individual may vary between individuals. So then when I look at the group average, I may end up coming away with a different picture of the spatial distribution of this function than I would if I were looking at an individual brain. And so Ev, my PI currently, started working originally in a vision lab in which this was kind of like a well-established fact about functional specialization in visual areas, and began trying to develop localizers that would also work for the domain of language. And she's developed several different localizers. Other groups have additionally developed localizers. So a localizer task might be like a commonly used one is sentences versus non-words. So I take sequences of words or non-words and I flash them on the screen. And the language network will respond much more strongly to words sequences that form sentences than it will to non-word sequences that don't correspond to words in my language and that don't form any kind of larger structure. And so this is interesting because these regions appear to be selectively involved in linguistic meaning. The two types of stimuli, sentences and non-words, are very perceptually similar. So what seems to be driving these responses is my ability to attach the visual stimulus to a word in my mental lexicon and or build a larger representation of the meaning of the sentence that I'm reading. And it turns out that you can get the same basic networks. The network is highly stable across lots of different localizer definitions. So I can compare sentences to word lists. I can compare sentences to so-called Jabberwocky stimuli, which are like non-words, but that have syntax, like the famous Jabberwocky poem from Lewis Carroll. I can compare Jabberwocky to non-words, and any of those contrasts will give me the same basic network. I can also use an entirely different localizer. So one commonly used one now is an auditory degradation localizer, where I compare intact speech to acoustically degraded speech that has similar acoustic properties, but that's not intelligible. And then recent work from the Braga lab has even shown that you can use functional correlation. So you just basically have people stare at a cross on a screen for a really long time, and then just measure which parts of the brain co-activate with each other, and then kind of parcel out the brain areas that fire together. And it turns out that winds up almost perfectly recovering the language network that you get from looking at, say, sentences versus non-words. So these kinds of findings, so selective deficits, stability across different tasks, stability within an individual across different runs of the same experiment, and then the fact that you can pull out the same network in a totally task-free way using functional correlation, lead me to the conclusion, along with many others, that there really is this natural kind in the brain, this functionally integrated network that has a systematic response. And then that response seems to be best characterized by the label language. So what's important about what I've just said is that the evidence comes from kind of diverse ways of conceiving of what language is, right? So you can think of each localizer task as a kind of definition of language of sorts. So for example, like the sentences versus non-words task, you can pick at different ways in which this might miss things that you would consider to be language or include things that you would not consider to be language. But when you have so many different ways of getting at the construct of language, or even construct neutral ways like functional correlation that all point to the same conclusion, then I think the question becomes less a matter of what is language so that we can study it in the brain, and more a matter of what is this network in the brain that exists independently of our definition of language doing? And so then a big part of my research program has been to try to figure out that question by asking different kinds of linguistically or theoretically informed questions about especially cognitive load predicted by theories of language comprehension and the degree to which that load loads onto the language network and what its response profile looks like.
You did this one study called No Evidence of Theory of Mind Reasoning in the Human Language Network. So you're separating this thing called theory of mind from the language selective network, the language selective cortex. And this is interesting because someone, not me per se, but someone could say, well, it sounds like you're just delineating what's language and what's not based on what is in this specific network and cortex. And then you're like tossing everything out. Not me, but someone like hypothetically could say that. So I guess what you said to me is that you're testing the quote unquote functional boundaries between language and the rest of cognition, right? Because the reality is that language probably influences a lot of other cognitive processes and a lot of other things that we count as cognition. So first off, what is theory of mind? And then secondly, you're, again, delineating theory of mind from language. Why are you doing that? There's good reasons that you're doing that, but tell us why. And if these two things are neurologically separable and localized in different areas of the brain, but yet so similar in their usage by humans, because I feel like theory of mind and language, as you're defining it, go together a lot of the time, just in practice, then what does that tell us?
Yeah. So to kind of like step back a little bit to your framing, yes, I want to clarify that when I'm talking about the language network, I'm talking about a kind of neuroscientific construct that is distinct from language. And future research may show that this network does other things that we might not consider to be language, or in addition, that there are things that this network does not do that could properly be described as language. So I think that like what the language network does and doesn't do is a separate question from what, for example, topics should be researched in the linguistics department. But still an important question because it really is, I think, a potentially fundamental insight about the functional organization of the human brain. And so the relation to theory of mind is potentially an important one that we spent some time looking at in a paper. So theory of mind is my ability to infer the contents of other people's thoughts. At least that's the definition we're using. And so we're separating that kind of what we'll call cognitive theory of mind from affective theory of mind. So like my ability to infer other people's emotions or feelings, but rather my ability to distinguish between my beliefs about the world and my interlocutors' beliefs about the world. So it's possible for me to have a particular belief, and it's possible for me to also know that Talia has a different belief than me about that thing, and that these two things can coexist. So this is probably important for several aspects of language use. So one, theory of mind may help inform the kinds of things that I choose to say in conversations. So knowing what the common ground is and what the differences are between our beliefs can help inform the kinds of utterances I make. It can also inform my interpretation of the things that are said to me. So for example, knowing, for example, about your fashion tastes could help infer whether or not you're being sarcastic when you compliment my outfit. And so all of these things, so the kinds of like, especially non-literal aspects of language use and language interpretation are probably heavily informed by theory of mind. But theory of mind is not necessarily strictly linguistic. So you can elicit theory of mind demand using non-linguistic materials. This is often done in kids, even pre-linguistic kids. You can do experiments where, you have a participant or like two kind of demonstrators that the kid is watching. One, we'll put an object in a container, then leave, and then the other one will move the object to a different container, and then the first person comes back, and you test, you create ways of testing to see whether the kid believes that the first person is going to look where they think the object is versus where the object actually is. That is, does the viewer maintain a distinction in their own mind between the truth and the beliefs of another person? And so this is a conceptually distinct ability from my ability to use language. And so pre-linguistic kids might or might not have it, and we can test that. Non-human animals might also have it, and people actively test that. So there's reason to think of these two things as separate. It turns out that there's reasonably good evidence that, like language, theory of mind seems to be supported in the brain by a specialized network. But the theory of mind network looks really similar to many parts of the language network. So its spatial distribution is highly similar to language. And there's actually been one recent study that provided direct evidence that the same voxels in the brain that respond to theory of mind demand also respond to language processing demands. This is a study by Ben Dean in 2015. So in the search for cognitive functions that language might overlap with, theory of mind is a particularly tantalizing one. And so that was our reason for investigating it in the first place. So one of the challenges in studying theory of mind and its relation to language is that in adults, theory of mind is often tested using linguistic materials. So a kind of standard theory of mind task is to have people look at a contrast between what are called false beliefs and false photos. So you have little story vignettes describing somebody who believes something that is false versus story vignettes describing some prior state of the world that is no longer true. So both involve something false, both involve stories of similar lengths. They're matched on all the different linguistic dimensions. But the key distinction between the two conditions is that only in the false beliefs condition is there a need for theory of mind, right? In the false photo condition, where something about the world has changed, there's no reason to think that some specific person has a false belief about the world. And so this task is often used to localize the theory of mind network. And so it turns out that this task, the false beliefs versus false photo tasks, also elicits a strong response in the language network. So if you localize the brain areas that respond most to sentences over non-words, those brain areas also respond more to false beliefs over false photos, suggesting some role in theory of mind. But if you identify theory of mind differently using a non-linguistic task, so in this case, watching a movie where you're comparing the brain's response to segments of the movie that depict theory of mind inferences or characters having false beliefs versus segments of the movie that depict other things, then you still get a big response in the theory of mind network, but no response in the language network. And then it turns out that the false beliefs and false photos materials used for the theory of mind localizer differ in linguistically important ways. So they kind of surprisingly use less frequent words. They have more complex sentence structure. The words are less predictable overall. And these are all things that we've already shown in other studies end up modulating activity in the language network. So kind of one of the methodological upshots of the study is that if you want to study overlap between language and other functions, it may be important to avoid language materials because they can kind of spuriously modulate activity in the language network in ways that are very difficult to control. So despite all of the attempts at experimental control, there still seem to be important differences that likely drive the language network response.
Cory Shain, so you're, for lack of a better word, computationally interested linguist. You do things with computers. You know how to code, you build large language models, you're working with neural networks, you do all these things. And yet you're about to go off to become a professor at Stanford. And granted, that is a huge thing. Congratulations. Not everyone gets the chance to be a professor in beautiful Palo Alto at Stanford. But you absolutely certainly, any computational linguist can absolutely certainly make a lot of money doing industry, doing consulting, doing other kinds of work. And I want to know why you're a professor and why you're choosing academia. Because this is absolutely a choice for you, given your specific position. So why academia?
Yeah, it's a good and hard question. So I gave you a bit of a post hoc description of my research interests that I think is true, but also kind of like covers over some of the autobiographical details. But in my case, yeah, I did start out wanting to work in computational linguistics, in part because I knew that academic jobs are really hard to get, and that computational skills are valued in industry, and it would help me kind of hedge my bets. I started my PhD expecting to narrow towards one kind of career path or the other a lot more quickly than ended up happening. So I would say that, I graduated from my PhD in 2021. I've been a postdoc now for a little over 2 years. And I did like a cycle of applications last year, so the 2021 cycle, and didn't land anything I wanted, and then did another this past cycle in 2022. But like even up until that point, I was really split in my interest between academia and industry. And I think that it's in part because of rather kind of non-overlapping advantages and disadvantages of the two career fields. So I think that in my case, like, as you mentioned, I have kids. I really value time with my family. And I think that industry tends to be a bit more family friendly than academia, just in terms of like more regular hours, usually fewer demands outside of work hours, and better pay, which translates into ease of supporting people that I'm responsible for, doing fun things, and so on. But I also was kind of like really drawn to the fact that academic PIs are, their own bosses. They can work on esoteric problems that interest them, even if they don't lead to like any improvements to some bottom line, and working with students. So I basically just kind of like split. I applied to all the industry jobs that seemed, or academic jobs that seemed relevant to me. And then like later, to try to coordinate any offers from industry and academia, I applied to a bunch of industry places too. And I did this that way in both cycles. I did have some successes on the industry side, but I really had a lot more on the academic side. And so that I think is a kind of like contingent and very kind of like specific outcome that is not generalizable. I think for the most part, there are a lot more jobs in industry than academia. But want to be now figuring out ways to support my own mentees in this path. And for many of them, that's going to involve entering an industry. For others, hopefully it'll involve entering academia.
Yeah, I just think it's revolutionary because a lot of people talk about how horrible it is to be an academic. Like, just to be candid about it, that's kind of a lot of the times the vibes you get from a lot of professors. And it's a very weird dynamic to watch as a student, to see some people be so excited like you are to go off and teach and like be tied to your work 24/7 and not have as much time for your children and not make as much money. And then some people, then they're like, you should not be a professor. You should really not do that. I think that there's a lot of choices that we're forced into, and there are a lot of constraints, and you have a lot of things to think about, for children being one of them. And I find it remarkable and laudable that you're becoming a professor.
Thanks. That's nice of you. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's really hard to get, in part because everybody's situation is so specific. Your goals are so specific. I guess if there is an upshot to my story that I want to pass along to folks who are also on the same path, it's be generous to yourself. And it's okay if you're uncertain. I was uncertain for a really long time and really only kind of like made up my mind once I had an offer in hand. We kind of contain multitudes, both within ourselves in terms of our preferences, as well as like the multiverse of possibilities for the future. And I think for many of us, there are a whole lot of different paths that would lead to happiness. So I guess the second take-home point that I might offer is, again, this is mostly hearsay. I can't like speak to this from personal experience, but it seems like there may be more flexibility than people often assume if you start down the tenure track and don't like it, or if you start down the industry track and don't like it. I think there's kind of more back and forth between these two sectors, at least in kind of like computational areas, than people often appreciate. You kind of think that you're kind of like starting down track and getting locked in. That may be less true than you think. If there are any students who want to work with me, apply to Stanford. But yeah, this has been really fun.
I've been telling everyone, like, I've been so nervous for this interview because your work is so prescient. Your research is going to be so important, I know, and we're going to see so many things from you in the next few years. And I feel like I'm catching you at this time when like you're about to like completely, you're the logarithm. You're going to be the logarithm. Like I see you on the axis and you're skyrocketing, just like processing cost.
Thank you so much for listening to Tomato. I have been your host, Talia Sherman, as always, and that was my interview with Professor Cory Shain. Links to his research are always available in the episode description. As always, please rate, review, subscribe, tell the algorithms that this is an incredibly popular podcast, that they should totally promote to more people. And I will speak to you next time. Bye.